Gerald shoved the manila folder across the glass-walled boardroom table. The sound of it sliding against polished wood fell too loud in the sudden silence. "The sale is closed," he announced, his voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute authority. I looked at my husband Colin, waiting for him to say something, anything. He just stared at the table, his jaw clenched tight. My stomach dropped. The assistant, Patricia, cleared her throat nervously. "The buyer has requested a meeting," she said quietly. Gerald waved his hand dismissively. "Tell them I'm available next Tuesday." Patricia's eyes flicked to me for just a moment. Actually, they specifically requested a meeting with Morgan. The room went still. Gerald's face hardened. Colin's head snapped up. And I felt the ground tilt beneath me. Why would a buyer who just acquired my husband's shares in the family company want to meet with me? I was just the operations manager. The person who fixed problems in the background while Gerald took credit up front. I wasn't family by blood. I wasn't a shareholder. I was just Morgan Hale, the woman who made the gears turn while everyone else pretended they didn't need me. My pulse steadied even as my voice threatened to shake. I looked directly at Gerald. "Who approved the sale?" I asked, keeping my tone level. Gerald's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Family decisions don't need your signature, Morgan. Colin's shares were his to manage." Except Colin looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His hands were flat on the table, knuckles white. He wasn't managing anything. He was drowning. "When is this meeting?" I asked Patricia, ignoring Gerald's attempt to dismiss me. "Tomorrow afternoon. 2:00. The buyer suggested the cafe on Sterling Avenue. Gerald leaned back in his chair. "Morgan, I don't think that's necessary. This is a family matter." "Then why did they ask for me specifically?" I countered. The silence that followed was loaded with tension. Finally, Gerald shrugged. "Do what you want. It won't change anything. The deal is done." I gathered my things and left the boardroom, my mind racing. Something was very wrong. I'd been the operations fixer for this company for 6 years. I knew every vendor, every contract, every hidden inefficiency. And I knew when something didn't add up. This didn't add up. I decided to take the meeting. I needed to know who this buyer was and what they wanted from me. I am Morgan Hale. For 6 years, I'd been the invisible backbone of Hale Manufacturing. When production schedules fell apart, I fixed them. When vendor relationships soured, I rebuilt them. When Gerald made promises the company couldn't keep, I found ways to keep them anyway. I'd married Colin 5 years ago, back when I thought partnership meant something. Back when I believed his family would eventually see me as more than just the woman who married into their world. I was wrong. Gerald ran the company like it was his personal kingdom. Colin, his only son, was supposed to inherit everything one day. But Colin had always been more comfortable following than leading. And Gerald had always been more comfortable taking credit than sharing power. I'd spent years watching Gerald erase my contributions. A successful vendor renegotiation became Gerald's strategic vision. A production efficiency improvement became the Hale family's commitment to excellence. My name never appeared in the press releases or the board presentations. I'd told myself it didn't matter. That I was building something bigger than recognition. That eventually, my work would speak for itself. Now, sitting in my office late that evening, I realized I'd been a fool. I'd given everything to a family that saw me as a tool, not a person. That was about to change. The cafe on Sterling Avenue was quiet when I arrived the next afternoon. I spotted her immediately. Mid-40s, perfectly tailored navy suit, dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She sat in a corner booth with a tablet in front of her and a confidence that filled the entire space. She stood when I approached, extending her hand. "Morgan Hale. I'm Evelyn Drake." Her handshake was firm, professional. I slid into the booth across from her, studying her carefully. "You bought my husband's shares." "I did," she confirmed, tapping her tablet. My resume appeared on the screen. Every project I'd completed. Every vendor relationship I'd salvaged. Every crisis I'd solved. You've been doing remarkable work, Evelyn continued. Work that's been systematically attributed to others. My throat tightened. Why did you want to meet with me? Because I didn't buy those shares to protect Gerald, she said bluntly. I bought leverage. And you're the only person in that company who actually knows how it works. She leaned forward slightly. I've been watching for months, Morgan. You're the reason Hale Manufacturing hasn't collapsed under Gerald's mismanagement. And I'm not interested in preserving his ego. I'm interested in results. What do you want from me? I asked carefully. Help me stabilize this company. Give me the real picture, not Gerald's fantasy version. In return, I'll give you something Gerald never will. What's that? Choices, Evelyn said simply. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Evelyn's words and about the pattern I'd been ignoring for years. It started 18 months ago. We'd had a major project deadline that Gerald had promised to a key client without checking our production capacity. I'd spent 3 weeks renegotiating vendor contracts, restructuring the workflow, and personally overseeing quality control to make it happen. We delivered on time. The client was thrilled. And at the company celebration, Gerald stood in front of everyone and talked about his vision, his leadership, his commitment to excellence. My name wasn't mentioned once. Colin had squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "You know your work matters, honey. That's what counts." But it didn't count. Not really. Because 6 months later, Gerald did it again. And 6 months after that. Each time, I fixed his mistakes. Each time, he took the credit. Each time, Colin told me to be patient, to be understanding, to remember that family dynamics were complicated. I'd been so focused on being the good daughter-in-law, the supportive wife, the reliable employee that I'd never stopped to ask myself what I was actually building. Now, lying awake at midnight, I finally had my answer. I'd been building Gerald's empire while my own worth disappeared into the shadows. I pulled out my laptop and started searching through old emails. There had to be more to this sale than Gerald was admitting. I started digging the next morning. Something about this sale felt wrong beyond just the principle of it. Colin's shares represented 30% of the company. That was a massive stake to sell without warning, without discussion, without any apparent negotiation. I pulled up the corporate records I had access to as operations manager. Board meeting minutes. Financial statements. Shareholder agreements. I found it buried in an email thread from 8 months ago. A short message from Gerald to the company attorney. Collateralize Colin's shares per attached note. Proceed quietly. I clicked through to the attachment. My blood ran cold. Colin's shares had been pledged as security for Gerald's personal loan. $3 million borrowed from a private equity firm. No disclosure to me. No board transparency. No acknowledgement that he was gambling with his son's inheritance. The maturity date on the loan jumped out at me. 19 days from now. I copied everything. The loan agreement, the security pledge, the interest schedule, the maturity date. Then I kept searching. There had to be more. An hour later, I found the sale agreement. The buyer had paid exactly enough to cover Gerald's loan plus penalties. This wasn't about business strategy. This was about Gerald covering his own mistakes by sacrificing his son's future. My hands shook as I saved copies to 3 different drives and emailed everything to my personal account. I got home after midnight. Colin was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, guilt written across his face. "You know," I said flatly. It wasn't a question. "It was temporary," he said quickly. "Dad needed capital for an investment opportunity. He promised the shares would be bought back within 6 months. That was 8 months ago, Colin. The investment didn't pan out." He took a drink. He had no choice but to sell to cover the loan. I set my bag down carefully, fighting to keep my voice steady. "You had a choice. You could have told me. Dad said it was family business. I'm your wife. I'm family too." Colin looked away. "You know how he is. He doesn't think you understand the complexities of corporate finance." The words hit like a slap. I've been running operations for 6 years. I've negotiated millions in contracts. But I don't understand corporate finance. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, I said coldly. You and your father decided I wasn't important enough to include in decisions that affect our entire future. My phone buzzed. A text from Gerald to Colin. I could see it on the counter where Colin had left his phone. Keep her out of this. I looked at my husband and saw clearly for the first time what I'd been refusing to see for years. He would always choose his father over me. No more secrets, I said firmly. From now on, I protect myself. I spent the weekend at my desk assembling a complete dossier. Board meeting minutes from the past 2 years. Side letters between Gerald and various investors. Shareholder agreements. Corporate bylaws. Financial statements. And most importantly, the drag-along rights provisions. According to the shareholder agreement, if Gerald wanted to force Colin to sell, he needed to follow specific procedures. Notice to all shareholders. Board approval. Fair market valuation by an independent appraiser. Opportunity for other shareholders to participate in the sale. I went through the documents line by line. None of those procedures had been followed. But there was something else. Something that made my pulse quicken. The drag-along rights only applied to Class A shares. Colin's shares, inherited from his grandfather, were Class B, different voting rights. Different sale restrictions. The drag-along provision Gerald had apparently relied on didn't even apply to Colin's share class. It was a fundamental legal error. Gerald had forced a sale he had no legal right to force. And either his attorneys had missed it, or they'd warned him and he'd done it anyway. I saved everything to 3 separate drives and emailed copies to my personal account. This was a lawful hole big enough to drive a truck through. Then I called Evelyn Drake. We need to talk, I said. I found something. Her response was immediate. Rooftop bar. 7 o'clock. And Morgan? Bring everything. The rooftop bar overlooked the city, glass walls on 3 sides reflecting the sunset. Evelyn was already there, a bottle of wine on the table. I slid into the seat across from her and pulled out my tablet. Before I show you this, I said carefully, I need to understand what you really want. I want certainty, Evelyn replied. I want a stable company with clean books and competent leadership. I don't want drama, and I don't want to discover surprises 6 months from now. What if I told you the sale was legally flawed? Her eyes sharpened. Show me. I walked her through it. The share class mismatch. The missing procedures. The collateralized loan that had never been disclosed to the board. Gerald's pattern of making unilateral decisions without proper authority. When I finished, Evelyn sat back with a slight smile. You know where all the bodies are buried. I know where the company actually works versus where Gerald pretends it works, I corrected. I can fix this. But it requires something Gerald will never accept. What's that? Accountability, I said. Real compliance. Proper documentation. Transparent dealings with vendors and suppliers. An actual audit of where money's been going. Evelyn considered this. You mentioned vendors. Is there a problem there? I hesitated, then decided to trust her. There's one supplier nobody wants to talk about. A logistics company that charges twice the market rate and delivers half the service. I've tried to change vendors 3 times. Gerald always blocks it. Start with that vendor, Evelyn said. Let's see where it leads. The supplier was called Northern Freight Solutions. On paper, they were a standard logistics company. In reality, they were a black hole where money disappeared. I drove out to their warehouse 2 days later, unannounced. The facility was smaller than their invoices suggested it should be. The manager, a nervous man named Pete, recognized me immediately. Mrs. Hale, he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. We weren't expecting you. I'm doing a routine audit, I lied smoothly. Nothing to worry about. Just need to verify some delivery records. His nervousness increased. Sure. Of course. Whatever you need. I spent an hour comparing their logs to our payment records. Deliveries that never happened. Trucks that didn't exist. Fees for services that were never performed. Pete watched me the whole time, sweating despite the cool air. Finally, I looked up at him. Pete, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Where is this money actually going? He looked like he might be sick. Then he pulled out 2 invoices from a desk drawer and slid them across to me. Same delivery dates. Same services. Different amounts. One matched what we paid. The other was 40% lower. Who gets the difference? I asked quietly. Pete swallowed hard. The shell company. Apex Consulting Services. The contact address is in the file. I photographed everything. Back in my car, I looked up Apex Consulting Services. The address was a small office building in a suburb 30 miles away. The registered agent was someone named Thomas Brennan. Gerald's college roommate. I needed allies. Gerald controlled the board through relationships and intimidation. But boards have legal responsibilities. Fiduciary duties. If they knew about the potential fraud, they couldn't ignore it. I scheduled a private lunch with one of the board members, Henry Whitmore. He'd always seemed uncomfortable with Gerald's more aggressive tactics. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown. Henry ordered a salad he didn't eat and sweated through his collar despite the air conditioning. I appreciate you making time, I started carefully. I've discovered some irregularities in the company's vendor relationships that I think the board should know about. Henry's face paled. Morgan, I'm not sure this is appropriate. I'm not asking you to do anything improper. I'm asking if the board was informed about the collateralization of Collins' shares before Gerald forced the sale. The silence stretched. Finally, Henry wiped his forehead with his napkin. No. We didn't see any memo. Gerald said it was a family matter that didn't require board approval. It did require board approval, I said gently. The bylaws are clear. Material pledges of shareholder equity need board consent. Gerald said it was handled. It wasn't. I slid a folder across the table. Just the relevant bylaws, highlighted. This isn't about blame, Henry. But the board has liability exposure here. If this comes out later, especially with the vendor irregularities, there could be serious consequences. Henry looked at the documents like they might explode. What do you want from me? If we call a meeting for cause, will you vote to investigate? He closed his eyes. Then nodded slowly. Yes. We owed Gerald favors for years. But this crosses a line. I needed legal advice. Not the company's attorney, who answered to Gerald. Someone independent who could help me navigate this without triggering a nuclear war. I found Audrey Simmons through a referral. Corporate litigation specialist with a reputation for being strategic rather than aggressive. I laid out everything in her office. The share class problem. The vendor issues. The collateralized loan. Gerald's pattern of unauthorized decisions. She listened without interrupting, making occasional notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. You have legitimate grounds for several actions, she said. But we need to be smart about timing and sequencing. Lawsuits are expensive and public. Let's keep that as a last resort. What do you recommend? Document everything first. Then trigger your inspection rights as a company officer. Request access to all books and records related to the share sale and vendor contracts. They have to comply within 10 days under state law. And if they refuse? Then we have grounds for immediate judicial intervention. But I don't think they will. Gerald's smart enough to know that refusal looks like hiding something. She tapped her pen against her notepad. Here's the key. The loan covenant date is in 19 days. If you time your inspection request to coincide with that deadline, you create maximum pressure. Gerald either cures the breaches, or the whole thing collapses. You think he'll crumble? Audrey smiled slightly. Men like Gerald always think they're untouchable. Until they're not. I left her office with a clear strategy and, for the first time in weeks, hope. That night, Colin finally broke. We were sitting in the living room, the space between us feeling like miles instead of feet. Dad threatened me, he said suddenly, his voice hollow. 6 months ago, when I questioned the loan. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd cut my salary and tell the board I was incompetent. The words hung in the air. I felt a surge of anger mixed with something unexpected. Pity. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Because I was ashamed, Colin said, meeting my eyes for the first time in days. I'm supposed to be his son, his successor. Instead, I'm just another person he manipulates. You could have stood up to him. I know. He looked away. I was weak. I am weak. I've spent my whole life trying to earn his approval, and all I've done is make myself smaller. I wanted to comfort him. To tell him it would be okay. But I couldn't. Not yet. You can't fix this with apologies, Colin. You need to fix it with actions. What do you mean? I pulled out a draft letter I'd prepared with Audrey. Tomorrow, you're going to sign this. It's a formal request to the board for access to all records related to your share sale. Under your rights as a former shareholder, you're entitled to that information. Dad will explode. Let him, I said firmly. You've spent years protecting him. It's time to protect yourself. Colin stared at the letter for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen and signed it. It wasn't redemption. But it was a start. We served the formal books and records request the next morning. Colin delivered it personally to Patricia, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. This needs to go to the entire board, Colin said, his voice stronger than I'd heard in weeks. And to the company attorney. Today. Patricia nodded nervously. I'll make sure they get it. By noon, my phone exploded with texts from Gerald. What the hell do you think you're doing? This is betrayal. You're turning my son against me. I didn't respond. Silence was its own kind of power. The company attorney called that afternoon. Mrs. Hale, I've received Mr. Hale's request. The company will comply within the statutory timeframe. 10 business days, I confirmed. We'll be expecting complete records. Any omissions will be noted. That evening, Gerald sent an email to Colin, copying the entire board. Subject, family loyalty. The body was a barely coherent rant about how I was a meddling outsider, who didn't understand the family business, and was destroying the company from within. Audrey's response when I forwarded it to her was immediate. Perfect. Print it. Save it. Never respond. That email is evidence of retaliation and will make any jury sympathetic to you. Gerald was unraveling. And we were just getting started. I felt no satisfaction, just cold determination. The legal clock had started ticking. Silence was now our greatest ally. Evelyn called the next morning. I've been reviewing my purchase agreement, she said without preamble. There's a right of first refusal provision in the original shareholder agreement. Was Colin given the opportunity to match any offer before the sale? I pulled up the shareholder agreement on my screen, scanning the relevant section. Yes. Section 7.3. Any proposed sale requires written notice to all shareholders with 30 days to match the terms. Did he receive that notice? I thought back through all the documents I'd reviewed. No. There's no record of it in any of the files I've accessed. Then the sale may be voidable, Evelyn said carefully. If the ROFR wasn't properly triggered, I might have a claim against Gerald for fraud. But more importantly, there might be a remedy that allows the sale to be reassigned. Reassigned to whom? I asked, though I was beginning to understand. To someone who should have been given the opportunity in the first place. Someone who could properly exercise that right. The implications settled over me slowly. You'd be willing to do that? I want a stable company with good management, Evelyn said. I don't particularly care whose name is on the share certificates. But I need to know the person holding those shares won't make the same mistakes Gerald did. I need a clean cap table, no hidden liabilities, and continuity with someone who actually knows how the company works. What are you proposing? Help me prove the ROFR breach. If we succeed, I'll assign the purchase option to you at cost. You can acquire Colin's shares yourself. Legitimately. Legally. Prove the breach, I repeated quietly. I can do that. The right of first refusal breach was surprisingly easy to prove. There was no notice in the corporate records. No email trail. No certified mail receipt. No documentation that any shareholder had been given the required 30-day opportunity to match the offer. Gerald had simply executed the sale without following the required procedures. I found the smoking gun in an old email where Gerald had explicitly told the company attorney to skip the ROFR notice to expedite closing. The attorney had responded with a warning that this could create legal issues. Gerald had replied, "Handle it. I'll take responsibility." Audrey drafted a crisp legal memorandum outlining the breach and the available remedies. Under Delaware corporate law, which governed our company, an improperly executed sale could be voided or, at the court's discretion, the sale rights could be assigned to the party who should have been given first refusal. In this case, that was the other shareholders. Which technically included me through my restricted stock options from years of service. Gerald had never wanted me to exercise those options. He'd kept them as unvested compensation, always promising they'd be worth something, eventually. Now they were going to be the key to everything. Evelyn filed a formal complaint with the board, alleging breach of the shareholder agreement and requesting an independent review. The board had no choice but to respond. We scheduled a special meeting for the following week. The endgame was beginning. The conference room felt smaller with tension filling every corner. Gerald sat at the head of the table, his face already red with barely contained rage. Colin sat beside him, looking miserable but determined. The board members were scattered around, uncomfortable and uncertain. Evelyn attended by video conference, her face calm and professional on the large screen mounted on the wall. I stood at the presentation screen and began methodically. Thank you for making time for this emergency meeting. I've prepared a summary of several governance issues that require immediate board attention. I walked them through it with cold precision. The share sale without proper ROFR notice. The collateralization of shareholder equity without board approval. The vendor relationships with unexplained cost disparities. The shell company with ties to Gerald's personal associates. The upcoming loan covenant deadline in just days. I showed documents, not accusations. Numbers, not emotions. Timeline after timeline demonstrating systematic violations of corporate governance. By the time I finished, 2 board members were taking notes furiously. Henry Whitmore looked grim but resolved. Gerald's face had gone from red to purple. This is absurd, he finally exploded, slamming his hand on the table. You're making allegations based on incomplete information and personal grudges. I'm presenting documented facts, I said calmly. If any of this information is incorrect, I'm happy to be corrected with supporting evidence. You have no right to question how I run this company. The board has every right, Henry interjected quietly. And a legal obligation. These are serious governance concerns that expose us to significant liability. Another board member spoke up. I move we open an independent review immediately. Second, Henry said firmly. Gerald stood up, his chair scraping loudly. You won't take my company. It's not your company, Gerald, I said quietly. It never was. The morning of Gerald's loan covenant deadline arrived cold and clear. I'd spent the previous night finalizing the vendor audit with an outside forensic accountant Evelyn had hired. The findings were damning. Northern Freight Solutions had overbilled by nearly $400,000 over 2 years. The excess funds had been transferred to Apex Consulting Services, which existed only on paper. From there, the trail led to personal accounts controlled by Thomas Brennan, Gerald's college roommate. The money had been used for personal expenses that had nothing to do with company business. The preliminary audit report landed on the board's desk and the bank's desk simultaneously at 9 in the morning. By 9:30, Gerald's bank was calling him for urgent clarification. They want documentation on the vendor relationships, Patricia told me quietly, her loyalty clearly shifting. They're concerned about the loan security and potential fraud implications. By noon, Gerald needed to provide either cash to cover the covenant or additional acceptable collateral. He had neither. The shares he'd used as security had already been sold. His personal assets were mortgaged to the hilt. He was out of options and out of time. I was in my office when he found me. He didn't knock. Just came in and closed the door, his face pale and desperate. "Walk away from this," he said, his voice tight. "I'll pay you $200,000. Just drop the investigation and let this go." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Gerald, are you offering me money to stop the board investigation?" "I'm offering you a generous settlement to avoid further family conflict." That sounds like an attempted bribe to interfere with a legal proceeding. His eyes widened as he noticed the phone recording. "You're recording this conversation?" "I am. And I'm declining your offer. The investigation will continue." He turned and left without another word. Evelyn's formal letter arrived at the company the next morning via courier. It was addressed to the board, with copies to all shareholders of record. The content was elegant in its legal precision. Given the clear breach of right of first refusal provisions and the improper sale procedures documented in the independent review, she was offering to cure the defect by assigning her purchase option to the party who should have been given first opportunity under the shareholder agreement. Me. The assignment would be at fair market value, the same price she paid. She'd pre-arranged financing through a standard management buyout program designed for exactly these situations. No special deals. No insider advantages. Just a legitimate correction of an improper sale following proper legal procedures. The letter noted that this resolution would provide maximum stability for the company, ensure experienced operational leadership continuity, and eliminate the governance concerns that had emerged during the review. It was perfect. Lawful, clean, and irresistible to a board facing significant liability exposure. The board called an emergency meeting for that afternoon. This time, Gerald brought his own attorney, an aggressive litigator who specialized in corporate warfare. He stood up as soon as the meeting began. "This is obviously collusive," he announced loudly. "Mrs. Hale has conspired with the buyer to steal shares that rightfully belong to my client's family. Those shares were never Gerald's to control," Audrey countered calmly. "And the sale was improperly executed in violation of explicit shareholder agreement provisions. This is a lawful remedy to cure a documented breach, not a conspiracy." The arguments went back and forth for over an hour. Finally, Henry called for a vote. The question: do we accept Miss Drake's offer to cure the ROFR breach through assignment to Mrs. Hale? The vote was 5-1. Only Gerald voted no. But there was one more vote to take. Henry stood, his face grave with the weight of what came next. "There's a separate matter requiring board action. Given the findings of the vendor audit, the improper share transactions, and the attempted interference with our investigation, I move that Gerald Hale be removed as CEO for cause, pending completion of the full forensic review." The room went absolutely silent. Gerald's face drained of all color. "You can't do this to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can," Henry said firmly. "And we must. The evidence suggests serious breaches of fiduciary duty and potential fraud. Until the investigation is complete, you cannot remain in a position of authority over company operations or finances." "Colin," Gerald turned to his son desperately, reaching for him. Tell them this is wrong. Tell them I was protecting the family." Colin looked at his father for a long, painful moment. Years of manipulation and control seemed to pass between them. Then he looked at me and found something he'd been missing. Strength. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said quietly but clearly. "But they're right. What you did was wrong. And I can't protect you from the consequences anymore." The vote was called. It was unanimous. Gerald removed for cause, effective immediately. Security was called to escort him from the building. He went silently, shock replacing his earlier rage and bluster. As the door closed behind him, Colin sat very still, his face pale. "What happens to me now?" he asked the room. "That depends," Henry said carefully. "On whether you cooperate fully with the investigation. On whether you're part of the problem or part of the solution going forward." Colin nodded slowly, understanding the choice before him. "I'll cooperate. I'll tell you everything I know." Evelyn executed the assignment 2 days later. The paperwork was handled by her attorneys and mine, with the board's outside counsel reviewing everything for compliance and proper procedure. The price was fair market value, verified by an independent appraiser who had no prior relationship with any party. The financing came through a management buyout program that specialized in employee ownership transitions. Everything was documented, transparent, and completely legal. No shortcuts. No favors. No special deals. I signed the final papers in Audrey's office, my hands steady. Colin signed his consent as the original shareholder, acknowledging the correction of the improper sale. Evelyn signed the assignment with a satisfied smile. Just like that, I owned 30% of Hale Manufacturing. The company I'd been building in silence for 6 years. I was now the second largest shareholder, with voting rights, board representation, and a voice that could no longer be ignored or erased. Everything Gerald had tried to keep from me. Everything I'd earned but never been given. Everything that was rightfully mine. There was still one audit item remaining, though. The final forensic report on the shell payments was due the next day. The last piece of evidence that would determine Gerald's ultimate fate. That evening, the full report arrived. The investigators had traced every dollar with meticulous precision. Gerald had routed nearly $500,000 in fraudulent, consulting fees, through Thomas Brennan's shell company over 3 years. The money had then been used for personal expenses that had nothing to do with legitimate business purposes. The independent board chair reviewed the final forensic report with obvious dismay and legal concern. "We have no choice," he said heavily. "We need to notify the bank immediately and potentially the authorities. This goes beyond poor judgment into potential criminal fraud." Gerald's personal guarantee on the loan would be called. His personal assets would be seized to cover the company's losses. He would face potential criminal charges for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Everything he'd built, every relationship he'd leveraged, every shortcut he'd taken, it was all collapsing. He'd done this to himself. Every choice. Every lie. Every moment of arrogance and believing he was above accountability. This was just consequence finally catching up. The board filed the required disclosures. The bank initiated collection proceedings. The stain attached to Gerald personally, not to the company. We were protected. That evening, Colin came to my office. We hadn't really talked since the board meeting. Hadn't discussed what any of this meant for our marriage or our future together. "Is there a future for us?" he asked simply, standing in the doorway. "For our marriage, I mean." I considered the question carefully, honestly. "There's a path," I said finally. "But it requires complete honesty from you. No more protecting your father. No more choosing him over us. Full cooperation with the investigation. The whole truth, no matter how bad it makes you look or how much it hurts." "I can do that," he said. "Can you?" I met his eyes directly. "Because for 5 years, you chose him every single time. You let him diminish me. You let him take credit for my work. You stood by while he sold your inheritance to cover his debts and his mistakes. I know." His voice broke. "I know I failed you. Failed myself." "Sign a sworn statement," I said, pushing a document across my desk. "Everything you know about the shell payments, the pressure tactics, the threats, the concealment. Everything." Colin picked up the statement and read through it slowly. 50 pages detailing Gerald's pattern of financial impropriety, intimidation, and fraud. It corroborated everything the forensic audit had found and more. It was complete. It was damning. And signing it would be choosing me over his father for the first time in his life. He picked up a pen and signed without hesitation. "I should have done this years ago," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just a chance to prove I can be better. That I can be the partner you deserved all along. This doesn't fix us," I said honestly. "It's just the first step. We have a very long way to go, and I make no promises about where we'll end up." "I understand." 2 days later, his sworn statement was filed with the board and provided to investigators. It was the final piece of evidence they needed. Gerald was finished. Maybe there was hope for Colin and me after all. But first, I had a company to stabilize and employees who deserved to know their jobs were secure. I called an all-hands meeting with the company workforce. No management. No board members. Just me and the people who actually made Hale manufacturing work every single day. They deserved to hear the truth directly from me. They deserved to know what had happened and what came next. They deserved transparency after years of Gerald's secrecy and manipulation. The production floor was packed when I arrived. Hundreds of employees gathered in nervous clusters, whispering anxiously about rumors they'd heard. Company meetings like this usually meant layoffs or plant closures. Bad news delivered impersonally. I stood on the small platform where supervisors usually gathered shift workers for daily briefings. No podium. No PowerPoint presentation. No corporate nonsense. Just me and them. Most of you know who I am, I started, my voice carrying across the quiet floor. I'm Morgan Hale. I've worked in operations here for 6 years. And as of this week, I'm also a major shareholder and member of the board. Murmurs spread through the crowd, surprised and uncertain. I'm not here to make grand promises or pretend everything is going to be perfect overnight, I continued honestly. The company has had some serious problems. Problems that the board is addressing. But I want you to know what my priorities are moving forward. I ticked them off on my fingers, making eye contact with workers throughout the room. First, safety. No production deadline is worth anyone getting hurt. Ever. Second, fair compensation. We're implementing a performance-based raise structure starting next quarter. Third, transparency. You deserve to know how the company is actually doing and where we're headed. No more secrets. More murmurs, these ones less worried and more hopeful. And fourth, respect. You all do remarkable work every single day. I've watched you solve impossible problems, meet unrealistic deadlines, and maintain quality standards that make this company successful. That deserves recognition, not just from me, but from everyone. A hand went up near the back. A long-time machine operator named Frank. What about Gerald? Gerald is no longer with the company, I said simply and clearly. The board made that decision based on serious governance issues. That's all I can say publicly while the investigation is ongoing. Another hand shot up. A younger woman from quality control. Are we going to be okay? Are our jobs safe? Yes, I said firmly, putting conviction behind the word. Not because of me alone. Because of all of you. You're what makes this company work. My job is just to make sure you have the resources and support you need to keep doing that excellent work. The meeting ended with cautious optimism replacing the earlier anxiety. Not celebration. Not relief exactly. Just the sense that maybe, finally, someone was actually paying attention to them. 6 months later, I stood in my office looking out at the production floor below. Orders were up significantly. Quality metrics were the strongest they'd been in 5 years. Employee retention had improved dramatically. People were staying because they felt valued. The company had stabilized faster than anyone predicted. With proper vendor relationships, transparent accounting, and competent leadership that actually listened, our profit margins had improved by 17% in the first quarter alone. Employee morale had increased measurably. Production quality had risen. Customers had noticed the difference and responded. We'd started winning back contracts we'd lost years ago. Industry publications had run stories about Hale Manufacturing's remarkable turnaround. They called it a case study in proper corporate governance. My name appeared in those articles now, not hidden in footnotes but prominently featured. Operations manager turned shareholder. Quiet professional who'd held the company together through crisis and emerged as a leader. It felt strange seeing recognition after years of invisibility. But it also felt right. This was what I'd built. Finally, people could see it clearly. Gerald faced civil fraud charges and criminal investigation. The bank had seized his personal assets. His reputation was completely destroyed. He'd sent a few desperate letters at first, trying to blame everyone else, claiming he'd been set up. I never responded. Neither did Colin. Neither did anyone. Gerald had destroyed himself through his own arrogance, greed, and absolute certainty that he was above consequences. We just documented what he'd done and let justice run its course. Colin and I had started marriage counseling. It was difficult, painful work. Conversations about trust, autonomy, partnership, and what marriage actually meant. We didn't have all the answers yet, not even close. But we were finally asking the right questions and doing the hard work. That was something. Maybe even everything. Evelyn visited quarterly for board meetings. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted from this investment. A stable company with clean books, competent leadership, and strong returns. "You've exceeded every expectation I had," she told me after our latest board meeting, genuine respect in her voice. "Thank you for trusting me when no one else did," I replied honestly. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "For recognizing what I was actually worth." I smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. I picked up my phone and looked at the screensaver. A photo from last week. Me standing in front of the production floor, surrounded by employees at our quarterly celebration. Confident. Valued. Finally visible. Gerald had spent years trying to keep me invisible, dismissing my contributions, erasing my work. He'd seen me as a threat to his control and had done everything possible to diminish me. He'd failed. I'd won not through anger or revenge, but through documentation, patience, and knowing my actual worth. I'd fought lawfully. Built carefully. Proved everything methodically. No drama. No public scenes. Just quiet, devastating competence that couldn't be denied or erased. The evening sun streamed through my office windows. I had work to finish before heading home. Reports to review. Decisions to make. A company to build properly this time. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. On a sticky note beside my keyboard, I'd written something Audrey had told me months ago. Words I looked at every single day now. Know your worth. Write it down. Make it lawful. Then build. No angry texts from Gerald. No contact from him at all anymore. Just work. Just growth. Just peace. I smiled and got back to building.